had planned the trip for months. The weather reports promised clear skies and cool nights, and the remote forest I picked on the map looked perfect, dense enough to feel isolated, yet with a small stream running through it to provide water. I had been camping alone before, but never this deep into the wilderness. My goal was simple: escape the city, clear my mind, and spend a few days entirely on my own. I packed carefully, double-checking my gear before leaving. My backpack was heavy but balanced. A tent, sleeping bag, food for 4 days, water purification tablets, a small stove, and all the essential survival tools. I also carried a first aid kit, a detailed map, and a compass. I did not bring a phone for GPS or entertainment. My intention was to disconnect entirely. The drive to the trailhead was long, winding through country roads that grew narrower as I approached the forest. By late afternoon, I reached a small dirt parking area, empty except for a couple of old trucks covered in dust. The trail started narrow and overgrown, the canopy thickening as I moved further in. The sound of the city faded quickly, replaced by birds, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. I felt a calm that I had not experienced in years, the kind that makes the mind quiet and the body relax. The first day passed without incident. I followed the trail alongside the stream, stopping occasionally to drink and refill my water bottle. The air was damp, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth, and sunlight filtered through the leaves in shifting patterns. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing, just large enough to pitch my tent. It was far enough from the stream to avoid flooding if it rained, but close enough to hear the gentle flow of water as I slept. I set up camp meticulously, ensuring the tent was secure, my food packed away in a bear-proof container, and my small stove ready. I made a simple meal of canned beans and instant rice, feeling the satisfaction of self-reliance. The night was quiet at first, the kind of silence that feels almost complete, broken only by the occasional call of an owl or the rustle of small animals. Around midnight, I was stirred by a sound I could not immediately identify. It was subtle, a low, dragging noise from somewhere beyond the clearing. I sat up, my flashlight in hand, scanning the dark edges of the trees. The forest was still, the shadows shifting with the dim beam. Whatever it was slow, deliberate, and moving closer. I stayed quiet, trying to determine the source. It was not the sound of a small animal, too heavy, too steady. My heart started to race. I reminded myself that this was a wilderness area, home to larger animals, but the thought did not calm me. Bears, deer, maybe a wild dog, but nothing about the sound was right. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the direction of the noise, and for a moment, the beam caught a glimpse of a large shape, hunched, moving cautiously along the treeline. I froze. The shape disappeared almost immediately, and the forest was silent again. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. I could see tracks in the mud near the stream earlier in the day, but I had dismissed them as deer. Now I wondered. The rustling began again, this time closer, circling the clearing. I could hear the heavy thud of footsteps on dry leaves and small branches snapping under weight. The sound made my stomach twist. I tried to remember everything I had learned in survival training. The rules were clear. Do not make noise, do not provoke, stay calm, and find a safe position. I gripped my flashlight and a small multi-tool I always carried, scanning the darkness. I considered moving to my car, but it was too far, and the idea of running through the dark forest seemed even more dangerous. Hours passed, or what felt like hours. I kept my flashlight dim, moving only when I absolutely needed to check my surroundings. The dragging sounds returned intermittently, always around the edges of the clearing, never directly confronting me. I did not sleep, knowing that any rest could be my last if whatever was out there decided to attack. The tension was exhausting. I realized that I had underestimated the reality of being alone in the wilderness. The forest was not friendly. It was neutral, indifferent, and yet full of life that could pose a threat. By dawn, I had learned enough. Whatever had been circling my camp had left during the night. I emerged cautiously from the tent, examining the perimeter. There were deep footprints, larger than a human's, leading from the edge of the treeline to my camp and back. I could not tell if it had been an animal or a person, but the pattern suggested observation, curiosity, or scouting. I knew then that I was not just alone. I had been watched. My sense of relief at daylight was tempered by a newfound caution. I spent the morning packing, deciding to move deeper into the forest but away from the open clearing, seeking a location where I could see the surrounding area clearly. The rest of the first day passed uneventfully, but I remained alert at all times, scanning every sound and shadow. On the second day, I encountered a problem I had not fully anticipated. The trail became less defined, overgrown and muddy from recent rain. My shoes were soaked, and the damp air made my movements slower. I relied heavily on my map and compass, trying to maintain a sense of direction. Around midday, I found signs of another human presence. Discarded wrappers, a torn backpack strap, and footprints that did not match mine. Anxiety rose sharply. Whoever had passed this way had not been far behind, and the realization that I might encounter someone with unknown intentions made every step tense. I was alone, unarmed except for my knife and multi-tool, and every instinct screamed caution. I decided to find a spot to rest near a ridge overlooking a small valley, thinking that height would give me a better vantage point. I collected firewood and set up a small, discreet camp, careful not to leave obvious signs of my presence. As I settled in for the night, the sounds began again. This time it was not dragging. There were voices, low and muffled, impossible to make out clearly. I froze, realizing they were moving through the forest below me. I could see shadows between the trees, fleeting glimpses of human shapes. Panic and fear surged, but I forced myself to remain calm. I needed a plan. Running blindly was dangerous. Staying exposed was dangerous. I remembered the lessons from survival guides. Maintain concealment, observe, and wait for the right opportunity. I spent hours watching, hidden behind rocks and thick undergrowth. The figures passed, disappearing into the darkness. I waited until long after they were gone before allowing myself a moment to breathe. My sleep was shallow, and I constantly checked my surroundings. By the next morning, I decided I could not stay on the ridge. The presence of others made the area unsafe, and I needed to move toward a safer exit. I packed quickly, leaving minimal trace, and started a careful descent along a less obvious path, avoiding the main trail. The journey became grueling. Muddy slopes, dense thickets, and fallen trees slowed me down. My body was sore, and my food supply was running low. I rationed carefully, eating small portions and drinking only what I needed. Every noise, every movement put me on edge. I began to recognize the signs of true fear: hypervigilance, exhaustion, and the constant anticipation of danger. It was unlike anything I had felt before. The forest, which had seemed serene during the day, became a maze of threats, both real and imagined. On the third day, the weather changed. Clouds gathered, and rain began to fall, light at first, then steady and cold. The trails became slippery, and I struggled to maintain balance. My clothing was soaked, my energy drained. I kept moving, knowing that staying in one place for too long was risky. That night, I found a small rock overhang near a cliff edge and decided to shelter there. It was not ideal, but it was better than being exposed. I huddled under the rocks, shivering, listening to the rain pounding the forest floor. The wind carried the sound of snapping branches and distant water flow, each noise making my heart jump. Sleep was impossible. The fourth day brought the turning point. I had planned to reach a stream that ran near a ranger station, where I knew I could find help. Navigating through the thick forest, I finally reached a recognizable landmark, a fallen tree with a red marking I had seen on the map. I felt a surge of relief, knowing I was close to civilization. Following the stream, I moved carefully, using rocks and branches to keep my footing. Hours later, the trees began to thin, and the sound of running water became more familiar. I reached the edge of a gravel road, and my first sight of a parked ranger vehicle made my heart pound with relief. I waved frantically, calling out until someone finally appeared. Exhaustion hit me fully as they approached, asking if I was okay. I nodded numbly, the tension of days dissolving into sheer relief. After I was escorted safely out of the forest, I reflected on the experience. I realized how unprepared I had been for the real dangers of the wilderness. Not just wildlife, but human presence, weather, and physical exhaustion. I had survived because I remained calm, cautious, and observant. I had learned the forest is not inherently dangerous, but it is indifferent, and underestimating it can have serious consequences. I also realized the importance of always leaving a detailed plan with someone, of having contingency routes, and of respecting the wilderness beyond the romanticized idea of adventure. By the time I reached my car and finally sat down, exhausted and covered in mud, I felt a mix of triumph and humility. The forest had tested me, and I had endured. I knew I would never forget those nights, the silent observers, the rain-soaked days, and the absolute clarity of survival. The trip taught me the value of preparation, vigilance, and patience. I had wanted solitude, and I had it, but at a cost I could never have fully anticipated. The forest had stripped me to my bare instincts, showing me both my strengths and my vulnerabilities. When I drove away, the trees disappearing behind me, I felt a deep, quiet respect for the wilderness, for the unseen creatures, and for the unpredictability of being truly alone. I had survived, but I had been changed, carrying with me a memory of tension, endurance, and a newfound understanding of just how raw and unforgiving the natural world could be. I would return one day, but I would return smarter, more prepared, and always aware that the forest is not a playground. It is a living, breathing environment that demands respect. I had been planning this camping trip for months. I wanted to escape the city, escape the noise, the people, and just be alone with nature. I chose a forest reserve about 3 hours drive from where I lived. It wasn't a highly popular spot, so I knew I wouldn't run into too many people. The map showed a trail leading deep into the woods, ending near a small, isolated clearing by a river. That was where I intended to set up camp. I packed all my usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, enough food and water for 3 days, first aid supplies, flashlight, matches, and a multi-tool. I even had a map, although I always carry a GPS as a backup. I felt ready. I thought I was experienced enough that nothing could go wrong. The drive was uneventful. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was already beginning its slow descent. The air smelled fresh, earthy, and faintly of pine. I parked my car and double-checked my backpack before setting off. The trail was narrow, sometimes just a footpath winding through dense trees. The ground was uneven, littered with fallen leaves, roots, and loose rocks. I could hear birds, squirrels rustling in the underbrush, and the occasional distant sound of a woodpecker. The first hour was easy. The trail rose gently and the forest opened up in small patches of sunlight that managed to pierce through the thick canopy. I felt calm, even happy, moving at a steady pace. I was alone, but I didn't mind. In fact, the solitude was part of the appeal. By the second hour, the trail grew rougher. Trees were closer together, their branches scratching against my arms as I brushed past. The undergrowth thickened, and I had to step carefully to avoid twisting an ankle on unseen roots. I kept checking my map to ensure I was heading in the right direction. It was around midday when I first noticed something strange. A small part of the trail had been disturbed. Footprints in the dirt weren't mine, and they didn't look old. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal, but the prints were too large, too deliberate. Human footprints. I scanned the area. No one was there. I felt a slight unease, but I rationalized it as other hikers who had passed by earlier. The forest was dense, and it was hard to see very far, so I told myself it wasn't anything to worry about. As the afternoon passed, the forest became quieter. The birds and small animals that had been moving earlier seemed to vanish. I couldn't hear much besides the crunching of my own boots on the leaves. I reached the clearing by the river just before sunset. It was more beautiful than I imagined. The water ran clear and fast, the bank dotted with smooth stones, and the space was large enough to set up my tent away from the trees. I picked a flat, dry area and began unpacking my gear. I set up the tent, gathered firewood, and started a small campfire. The warmth and crackling sound of the flames were comforting. I boiled water for dinner and ate quietly, appreciating the solitude. The sun disappeared completely behind the trees, leaving the clearing in twilight. I took out my flashlight and explored the riverbank for a bit, just enjoying the quiet. But something felt off. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, a creeping sense of being watched. I shook it off, blaming the isolation and my imagination. Night settled in quickly. I crawled into my sleeping bag, the fire still burning low nearby. The forest at night was darker than I expected. I could hear the distant call of an owl and the rustling of leaves, but something felt different. The usual calm of the night felt heavier, almost tense. I couldn't see anything beyond a few meters, and shadows seemed to move unnaturally in the corner of my vision. I tried to sleep, but the unease lingered. Around midnight, I woke to a faint sound, a crackling of twigs somewhere beyond the clearing. My heart skipped a beat. I stayed still, listening. The sound repeated, closer this time, moving slowly. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then I remembered the footprints I had seen earlier. My unease returned with full force. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the clearing. Nothing. The beam caught on the river, on the trees, but no one was there. I decided to stay awake for a while, listening intently. The forest seemed alive in a different way at night. Every small noise amplified. Every branch snapping made me flinch. The sound of footsteps came again, unmistakably human, slow, deliberate. My stomach sank. Whoever it was, they were moving closer to my camp. I considered packing up and leaving immediately, but the thought of moving in total darkness along the riverbank filled me with fear. I wasn't sure what to do. The footsteps stopped. Silence returned, but it felt heavier, as if the forest was holding its breath. I sat up, clutching my flashlight like a weapon. Then I heard the faintest sound of a voice, or maybe just a whisper. It was indistinct, carried by the wind, impossible to understand. I froze, straining to listen. Came again, closer. My mind raced through possibilities. A lost hiker? Someone with ill intentions? Or just my imagination? I knew I couldn't sit there frozen. I needed to be ready to defend myself. I grabbed my multi-tool and positioned myself near the fire, keeping the flashlight ready. The shadows beyond the clearing were thick. I could see movement at the edge of the light. Something or someone was there. Then I saw it. A figure hunched, moving slowly along the tree line. I couldn't make out details, but I could see it was human. My pulse raced. I didn't know if it was dangerous, but instinct told me it could be. I quietly slid out of the tent, keeping the fire between me and the figure. I backed toward a tree for cover, staying low. The figure stopped, and the forest went silent again. Then, without warning, a branch snapped loudly just behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight. Nothing. My heart pounded. I realized I was no longer safe where I was. I had to get to my car. But that meant crossing the trail in the dark, possibly past whoever or whatever was out there. I waited a moment, listening. The figure didn't move. That gave me an opportunity. I started moving quietly along the edge of the clearing, keeping trees between myself and the open space. My backpack slowed me down, but I moved steadily. Every sound made me freeze. A rustle of leaves, a snapping twig, the distant flow of the river. I stayed close to the tree line, using the shadows as cover. Minutes felt like hours. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst. Finally, I reached a spot where the trail curved away from the clearing. I had to make a run for it. I sprinted, boots slapping against the dirt, flashlight bobbing in my hand. Behind me, I heard movement. I didn't look back. I just ran as fast as I could, stumbling over roots and rocks, adrenaline keeping me upright. The figure didn't follow, or maybe it did, but I didn't stop to notice. I just kept moving, not daring to pause until I saw the faint glow of my car's dashboard lights. I reached the car, breathless, shaking, heart hammering. I locked the doors, threw my backpack in the back seat, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, revealing the empty trail behind me. The forest looked calm again, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I didn't know who or what had been out there, and I didn't want to find out. I drove slowly back to the main road, keeping my eyes on the rearview mirror. The forest faded behind me, quiet and dark. When I finally reached a gas station 20 minutes later, I pulled in and parked, trembling. I checked my phone. Full bars. I called a friend and told them where I had been. I explained what happened, leaving out nothing. They urged me to report it to the local ranger station. I agreed. I stayed there, inside the warm, brightly lit building, drinking coffee, until I felt my hands stop shaking. The next morning, I went back with the ranger to check the trail. The footprints I had seen were still there, fresh, leading to the clearing and then disappearing into the deeper woods. There were signs that someone had been moving around recently. Broken branches, flattened grass, remnants of what looked like a makeshift camp. They couldn't find anyone, but they took my statement seriously and increased patrols in the area. That experience changed me. I no longer took the forest for granted. I learned that being prepared meant more than bringing food, water, and gear. It meant being aware, cautious, and ready for the unpredictable. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone in a place that remote. I learned to respect the fact that even in a beautiful, peaceful forest, danger could be very real, and it could come silently, unseen at any moment. That night, and those few hours of running through the trees, are etched into my memory. I can still feel the fear, the cold sweat, the pounding of my heart. But I also remember the relief when I reached my car, the warmth of the coffee, and the sense of safety in light and human presence. I survived because I stayed alert, because I listened, and because I acted. And that is a lesson I carry with me every time I step into the woods. I had been planning the trip for months, carefully mapping out the route and picking a site deep in the national forest where I could escape the constant hum of the city. I wanted isolation, quiet, and the kind of solitude that could only come from being miles away from any other human presence. The trailhead was several hours from my apartment, tucked off a rough gravel road that had long been abandoned by most travelers. My car crawled over potholes and loose rocks, and I had to keep my hands tight on the steering wheel as dust and debris kicked up around me. By the time I reached the last parking area, the sun was beginning to lean low, casting long shadows between the pine and oak trees. I felt a rush of anticipation mixed with the nervous tension I always felt when I was about to spend a night alone in the wild. I unloaded my pack, checking each item twice. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water, first aid kit, knife, flashlight, extra batteries. I had hiked alone before, but this trip was meant to be longer and deeper than any I had taken recently. The path from the parking area to my intended site was steep, narrow, and lined with underbrush, and I had to push branches aside as I climbed, feeling the weight of my pack dig into my shoulders. Sweat ran down my back, and my legs ached as I finally reached a clearing that would serve as my campsite. It was elevated slightly, giving me a view over a small valley, and I liked the fact that there was a creek not too far away. The site felt private and remote, exactly what I had hoped for. I set up my tent meticulously, hammering stakes into the rocky ground and making sure it was taut. I cleared the area of sticks and stones, creating a small circle for a fire pit. Then I unpacked the stove and set it up on a flat rock, ready to prepare dinner. I had brought simple food, dried pasta, a small can of beans, some jerky, but even this simple act of cooking in the wilderness felt grounding. As I ate, I kept glancing at the tree line, aware of the sounds around me. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the sudden snap of a twig. None of it was unusual, but in the quiet of the forest, every sound seemed amplified. I told myself it was all normal, part of being outdoors. Night fell and the air cooled sharply. I lit the campfire and watched the flames flicker, casting shadows that stretched like fingers into the surrounding woods. The forest at night felt alive in a way it did not during the day. I could hear the creek babbling, the wind rustling through branches, and occasional animal sounds. Perhaps deer, maybe a raccoon. I kept the fire going, knowing that the warmth and light were my safety. I also had my flashlight within reach and the knife strapped to my pack. I was cautious by habit, not by fear, but I knew better than to be complacent. Sometime around midnight, I woke to a subtle change in the sounds of the forest. The creek still gurgled, the wind whispered, but there was now something else. A faint rustling, deliberate and heavier than a small animal. I froze in my sleeping bag, straining my ears. The noise came from just beyond the edge of my clearing, moving slowly with a careful, almost patient rhythm. My heart rate increased, but I reminded myself that bears and other wildlife often moved at night. Still, something about the way the sound shifted and paused felt different, more intentional. I sat up quietly, holding the flashlight and scanning the treeline. Nothing. Darkness seemed to press against the circle of my firelight. I tried to steady my breathing and listened again. The rustling started again, closer this time, breaking the quiet like someone was stepping on dry twigs. I considered leaving the tent to confront whatever it was, but caution won over curiosity. I stayed inside, clutching my knife and shining the flashlight intermittently at the edges of the clearing. The fire was dwindling, so I fed it a few logs to keep a strong glow. Then I heard it, a low, almost imperceptible sound that was not animal. Not a growl or a chirp, but a deliberate crunch, the kind of sound human boots might make on the forest floor. My stomach tightened. I had told myself this was unlikely, that the forest was mostly empty at night, but my rationality was being challenged by instinct. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, my flashlight sweeping slowly over the trees. The sound of footsteps continued, stopping and starting, as if whoever it was moving carefully but unsure. I could hear them circling the perimeter of my clearing. My mind raced. Someone had to be here, someone who had followed the path I took. The thought of a hiker seemed unlikely. They would likely have camped elsewhere. This felt targeted, as though someone had been watching me. Panic began to rise, and I forced myself to think logically. My pack was within reach, and I could grab my phone. I reached for it, trying to remain quiet. Signal was weak, but I had one bar. I typed a quick message to my friend back in the city, simply stating my location and that something felt wrong. Then I hit send. The footsteps stopped again. I could hear nothing but the creak and the wind. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of a branch snapping close to the tent. Adrenaline surged. I grabbed my knife, unzipped the tent slightly, and shone the flashlight toward the sound. In the beam, I saw movement, a shadow slipping between trees, just at the edge of visibility. My mind screamed at me to get out. I had to leave. I grabbed my pack, shoved essentials inside, snuffed the fire to avoid being seen, and started moving cautiously toward the creek. I stayed low, using the sound of the running water to mask my own footsteps. The forest seemed endless, black and oppressive. Every snap of a twig under my feet made my heart race. I knew I had to put distance between myself and whoever or whatever was following. My breathing became loud in my own ears. I moved carefully but steadily, keeping the creek on one side. After what felt like hours, I noticed a faint glimmer of moonlight reflecting on water downstream, suggesting the creek widened and might lead to a road or a clearing. I decided to follow it. Hours passed as I navigated the underbrush and rocks. My legs were scraped, my hands scratched by branches, and the cold began to seep into my bones. Yet the instinct to survive pushed me onward. Eventually, I came upon a dirt path, likely an old service road. I recognized it from the map I had studied before the trip. Relief surged through me. I walked along the road cautiously, and after another hour, I finally saw headlights in the distance. My pace quickened, waving my hands and shouting until the vehicle slowed and stopped. It was a park ranger on a routine patrol. I explained as much as I could, pointing toward my campsite. The ranger radioed for backup, and within the hour, another vehicle arrived with additional officers. They combed the area I had camped in, finding signs that someone had indeed been there. Footprints around my cleared tent area, a small pile of trash that had been moved carefully to avoid leaving obvious signs, and scratch marks on a tree near where I had slept. They told me that while most hikers and campers were law-abiding, there had been reports of people following and threatening solo travelers in that forest. I was taken back to my car, shaken but physically unharmed. My pack was intact, though some items had clearly been handled. The ranger suggested that I contact local authorities if I wanted to press charges, but the identity of whoever had been circling me remained unknown. It was unnerving to realize how close it had come, how easy it would have been for someone with ill intent to take advantage of the isolation. That night, back in my apartment, I unpacked the gear I had brought. Every stick, rock, and bit of debris in my bag reminded me of the ordeal. I knew I had survived because of a combination of preparation, caution, and a bit of luck. I resolved never to camp alone in such a remote area again. While the forest was beautiful, it had a raw unpredictability that I had underestimated. I kept thinking of the footprints, the sound of deliberate movement, the way the shadows had seemed to stretch toward me. The experience stayed with me for weeks. I returned to the forest months later, but only on trails where other people were present. The fear I felt had tempered my adventurousness with a new caution. I had learned the importance of preparation, awareness, and respecting the wilderness not just for its beauty, but for the real dangers, human and natural, that could exist there. It was a lesson I carried with me, one that made me more vigilant, more aware, and ultimately more alive in the quiet moments of both city and wilderness life. In the end, the experience had a clear resolution. I had survived without injury, I had learned a critical lesson in safety, and I had grown stronger mentally and emotionally. The forest had tested me, and while it had been terrifying, it had also reminded me of the resilience humans can find within themselves when faced with real danger. I would always remember the night I felt eyes on me, the careful crunch of footsteps in the dark, and the cold thrill of knowing that survival depended on nothing more than my own wits and determination. That clarity and the detailed memory of every step, every sound, and every shadow stayed with me as a lasting lesson in respect, caution, and vigilance in the wilderness. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. It was the perfect escape from the constant hum of the city, the noise, the work emails, the pressure that always seemed to follow me like a shadow I could never shake. I chose a remote section of forest I had never visited before, a place marked on maps as mostly untouched, far from any paved roads or signs of civilization. The sense of solitude and isolation was what drew me there. I wanted to disconnect completely, to feel the silence in my bones and breathe air that wasn't laced with exhaust fumes. I packed carefully for days, making sure I had all the essentials. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, a portable stove, water, and enough non-perishable food to last a week. I also packed a small first aid kit, a reliable flashlight, and a map and compass. I had learned over the years that overconfidence in the wilderness can be dangerous, and I didn't want to take any chances. The drive to the trailhead was long and quiet. As I left the last small town behind, the roads narrowed, the pavement rougher, and the trees thickened on either side, forming a dark, green tunnel. By the time I parked my car and checked my supplies, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. I shouldered my backpack and started the hike, following the trail marked on my map. The air was crisp, with a slight chill that hinted at the approaching winter, and the earthy smell of fallen leaves and damp soil filled my nose. At first, the hike was peaceful. The sound of my boots crunching on the dirt path and the occasional bird or squirrel were the only noises. I felt a thrill at the thought of being completely alone in the wilderness, far from anyone else. The trail wound through dense forest, over small streams, and around steep ridges. By mid-afternoon, I decided to set up camp near a small clearing I found beside a slow-moving creek. The location seemed perfect. It was near water, flat enough for my tent, and hidden enough that I wouldn't be easily seen from the trail. I spent the next hour unpacking and setting up. I cleared a small patch of ground for the tent, hammered the stakes into the soil, and carefully secured the rainfly. I gathered firewood, choosing pieces that were dry and straight, and stacked them near the site for easy access. I cooked a simple meal on my portable stove, enjoying the solitude and the sound of water trickling nearby. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I watched the forest grow darker, the shadows stretching and twisting in ways that made the trees look almost alive. I lit a small campfire, its flames dancing and crackling, and sat back against a log, feeling the warmth against the growing chill of the night. The first night passed uneventfully, though I stayed alert. I knew the forest was home to all sorts of wildlife, and while most animals would avoid humans, there was always the chance of encountering something dangerous. I had a flashlight within reach and kept my knife close, just in case. The sounds of the forest at night were different from the daytime. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the distant sound of running water, and the occasional snap of a twig that made my heart race for a moment before I reminded myself that most of it was harmless. I slept lightly, waking every so often to the movement of animals or the shift of the wind in the trees. The next day, I decided to explore further. I followed a narrow path that led deeper into the forest, away from the creek and the safety of my camp. The trees grew denser, and the sunlight barely reached the forest floor. I noticed animal tracks in the mud, deer, maybe, or a fox, and occasionally saw signs of other wildlife. As I hiked, I felt a sense of exhilaration and unease at the same time. There was beauty in the isolation, but also an underlying tension. I was alone in a vast wilderness where a single misstep could have serious consequences. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I noticed something that made me pause. Fresh tire tracks crossed the path ahead, leading deeper into the forest. They didn't belong to any normal Forest Service vehicle. The pattern suggested a heavier vehicle, perhaps a pickup or SUV. That alone wouldn't have been alarming, but the fact that the tracks were fresh and seemed out of place in such a remote area made me uneasy. I decided to keep moving, staying on higher ground where I could see more of the surroundings. By late afternoon, I realized I had ventured further than I intended. The trail became less distinct, overgrown with vegetation, and I found myself relying more on my compass than on the path itself. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so, and I began to feel a creeping sense of vulnerability. I considered turning back, but I thought I could make it to a vantage point I had marked on my map and then return to camp. That's when I noticed the sound. A faint rustling, almost like someone moving through the underbrush, keeping pace with me. My heart rate quickened. I stopped and listened carefully. The noise stopped as soon as I froze. I moved again, taking slow, deliberate steps, and the rustling resumed, always just out of sight. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal, a deer or a fox, following its path, but instinct told me to be cautious. I didn't want to confront whatever it was without a clear escape route. I changed direction slightly, attempting to loop back toward the main trail. The rustling followed. I started walking faster, my eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. I realized then that the forest could conceal not just animals, but people, and the thought made my stomach twist. I had heard stories of people getting lost, of strangers encountering dangerous individuals in remote areas. Panic began to creep in, though I tried to keep it in check. After what felt like hours, I finally saw a familiar landmark, a large boulder I had passed on my way to the vantage point. Relief washed over me. I made my way around it, staying low and trying to move quietly. But then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a human voice, a low murmur carried by the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but it was enough to confirm my fear. Someone else was nearby, and they were not on the trail with me for recreation. I picked up my pace, heading for the creek and my camp. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, shadows growing longer and more menacing as the sun dipped lower. My backpack felt heavier with each step, my legs aching, my lungs burning. I reached the creek and slowed down, trying to catch my breath and assess the situation. I knew I couldn't outrun a determined person in the forest if they caught sight of me. I needed a plan. I remembered the small ridge behind my camp. If I could reach it, I could get a better view of the surrounding area and maybe spot whoever was following me. I moved cautiously, keeping low, listening for any sign of pursuit. When I reached the ridge, I froze. In the fading light, I saw movement near my campsite, Someone crouched, scanning the area, as if looking for me. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a random hiker. Whoever it was, they had been watching me. I backed away slowly, trying to put distance between myself and the intruder. I considered running to my car, but it was several kilometers away, and the forest was dense. I needed another strategy. I remembered the creek. If I could cross it and move along the far bank, I might be able to put enough distance between us to reach safety. I waited until the figure turned their back, then slipped down the ridge toward the water. The creek was cold and shallow, but crossing it was slow and noisy. I had to keep my balance on slippery rocks, every step sending a jolt through my legs. I made it across, and the person didn't seem to notice. I ducked into the trees on the far side, moving quietly, keeping the creek between us. The shadows grew darker, and I realized I was now off any marked trail. Every step felt dangerous. I could get lost, but staying put was not an option. Night fell completely as I moved through the forest. I relied on the small flashlight in my pocket, careful to use it sparingly to avoid drawing attention. My mind raced with every possible scenario. What if they were armed? What if they had been following me for hours, waiting for the right moment? I forced myself to stay calm, focusing on each step, each decision. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a narrow dirt path I hadn't seen before. It seemed to lead upward, and I followed it, hoping it would connect with the main trail or lead me closer to my car. My legs were exhausted, my body sore, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I climbed for nearly an hour until I reached a small ridge that overlooked the forest below. In the moonlight, I could see the faint glimmer of my campsite far across the trees. Empty now. Whoever had been there was gone. I stayed on the ridge for a long time, listening. The forest was silent except for the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of small animals. I finally allowed myself to relax slightly, though my senses remained alert. I realized I needed to make a decision. I couldn't stay in the forest all night. I began moving in the direction I believed my car was, using my map and compass. Hours later, just before dawn, I emerged from the trees onto a dirt road. My car was there, exactly where I had left it, and I felt a wave of relief so strong it brought tears to my eyes. I double-checked the doors, then sat inside for a few minutes, breathing heavily, letting my body recover. The forest had tested me, had pushed me to the edge of fear, but I had made it through. Driving away, I reflected on everything that had happened. I realized how unprepared I would have been if I hadn't stayed alert, if I had assumed the forest was empty, if I had ignored my instincts. The experience left me shaken but also stronger, more aware of the fine line between adventure and danger. I knew I would return to the wilderness one day, but never without respect for its power and unpredictability. The forest was beautiful, yes, but it was also a place where mistakes could be fatal. I had survived, and that survival felt like a hard-earned victory. By the time I reached the nearest town, the sun had risen fully, painting the streets in warm light. I parked at a small cafe, bought a cup of coffee, and just sat there, letting the normalcy of the world wash over me. I had been through fear, isolation, and the raw unpredictability of nature, and I had come out alive. That clarity, that knowledge that I could handle the wilderness and its dangers, stayed with me. It was a lesson I would carry forever. Respect the wild, trust your instincts, and never take solitude for granted, because you never know what might be watching, just out of sight. I had been planning this camping trip for months. It was supposed to be a simple solo weekend in the wilderness, a chance to disconnect from everything and just be alone with nature. I packed everything I thought I might need, laid out all my gear on the floor of my small apartment, and double-checked every item. Tent, sleeping bag, backpack, cooking gear, extra food, water, matches, first aid kit, flashlight, extra batteries. I even brought a map and a compass, things I usually ignored in my normal hikes. I told myself I was being careful, but in hindsight, I realized that careful doesn't always mean safe. I left early on Friday morning, driving a few hours to a remote area I had scouted on maps weeks before. It was a rugged part of the forest, with no cell signal and only a few dirt trails cutting through miles of dense trees. I parked my car at the trailhead and started hiking in, my backpack heavy with all the gear. The trail was narrow and uneven, the kind that winds unpredictably through thick woods. There were tree roots sticking up from the ground, and I had to step carefully to avoid twisting my ankle. Birds chirped, leaves rustled in the wind, and for the first few hours, the world felt peaceful and normal. I had chosen a campsite near a small clearing by a river I had spotted on satellite maps. I imagined myself setting up the tent, starting a small fire, cooking some simple food, and spending the night listening to the sounds of the forest. I was imagining this perfect scenario as I hiked, unaware of how drastically things could change in just a few hours. By mid-afternoon, I had reached the clearing. It was beautiful. The river was narrow but fast-moving, its surface glinting in the sunlight. The trees were thick around the edges of the clearing, and the ground was relatively flat. It seemed ideal. I set up my tent, hammered the stakes into the soil, and laid out my sleeping bag. Then I started gathering wood for a fire. I wanted the warmth and the light. I stacked a small pile of dry branches and twigs, and finally, after a bit of struggling, managed to get the fire going. The flames crackled, and the smell of burning wood mixed with the damp forest air. I ate a simple meal I had packed: canned beans, bread, and some chocolate, and felt content, enjoying the solitude. As the sun started to dip below the horizon, the forest changed. Shadows grew long and dark, twisting among the trees, and the cheerful chirping of birds faded into an eerie silence. The only sounds were the river and occasional distant snaps of branches. I kept telling myself it was normal, just the quiet of the forest, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My skin prickled, my senses became sharp, every rustle in the bushes or creak of a tree making my heart jump. Night fell faster than I expected. I had a flashlight and lantern, but I wanted to save my batteries, so I mostly relied on the firelight. That's when the first real sign that something was wrong appeared. I heard a rustling noise near the edge of the clearing, a noise too deliberate and too heavy to be a small animal. I froze. My eyes scanned the darkness beyond the firelight. Nothing. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, but the sound came again, this time closer, just beyond the trees. Something large was moving quietly, deliberately. My heart started beating fast. I didn't have a weapon, only a small pocket knife, and even that wouldn't do much against something big. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, that the shadows were playing tricks on me. But then I noticed something I hadn't before. A faint trail in the dirt, footsteps that weren't mine, leading from the tree line toward the clearing. Panic settled in. I realized that whatever was out there had been watching me, maybe following me from the trail. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the trees. My light caught movement. A large figure, crouched low, almost blending into the shadows. I couldn't see it clearly, but it was bigger than any deer. Bigger than a bear, maybe. I froze, trying to decide what to do. My first instinct was to stay calm, but my body was trembling. I realized I had no way to call for help. No cell signal, no one nearby. If this was some kind of human threat, I was completely alone. If it was an animal, I was still vulnerable. I thought about staying in my tent, but the tent offered no protection. I grabbed my backpack and started moving quietly toward the river, hoping to find a safer place. The ground was uneven, and every step made a crunching noise on the dry leaves. The figure moved too. I saw it shift, disappear behind a tree, reappear, always staying in the shadows. My mind raced, trying to figure out what I was dealing with. A bear? Maybe. Person? Possibly. Either way, I was in danger. I kept moving along the edge of the clearing, hugging the tree line. My plan was to follow the river downstream, hoping to find another clearing or maybe a trail. The forest grew thicker, the underbrush harder to navigate. My flashlight was useless beyond a few meters, and the shadows seemed alive. The figure kept following, always just far enough to remain unseen clearly, but close enough to make me feel its presence. I kept thinking about my options. I had no weapon, limited light, and the element of surprise was gone. If this was a human, I couldn't outrun it in the woods. If it was an animal, I had even less chance. After what felt like hours, I stumbled into a narrow gorge along the river. The cliffs on either side were steep, and the ground was muddy and slick. I realized I had no choice. I had to climb up one side to get out of the gorge and maybe find a trail. As I started climbing, I slipped, barely catching myself on a tree root. The figure made a sound, a low growl or groan. I couldn't tell. My adrenaline spiked, and I scrambled up as fast as I could, branches scratching my arms and face. I reached the top and looked around. The forest opened slightly, and I spotted what looked like an old dirt road. It wasn't far. My heart leapt. I might actually get out. I moved cautiously toward the road, staying in the shadows. Every step I took, I listened for the rustle behind me. The figure hadn't followed immediately, but I knew it was still there, somewhere watching. I reached the road as the moon rose, its light casting long shadows across the dirt. The road was abandoned, overgrown in places, but it gave me hope. I followed it slowly, scanning the forest on either side, ready to run if anything appeared. Hours passed. The figure never reappeared. My fear kept me moving, my exhaustion mounting. I didn't stop until I saw headlights in the distance. Relief flooded me. I ran toward the lights, waving my arms. It was a couple in a truck. I didn't stop to explain, just climbed into the bed of the truck, panting, shaking, terrified but alive. They looked at me with concern, and I finally felt safe. I explained quickly that I had been camping alone. Someone or something was following me, and I needed to get back to civilization. They didn't ask many questions. They just nodded and drove me to the nearest town. In town, I went to the police station. They took my story seriously, checked the area, and found evidence of someone trespassing or living in the woods. There were signs of a makeshift camp, footprints, and tools that weren't mine. They told me it could have been someone watching campers, someone who had been in that area for weeks, possibly months. I was lucky to get out when I did. The officers advised me never to camp alone in remote areas again, and to always leave a detailed plan with someone about my route and schedule. The next few weeks, I couldn't shake the memory. I replayed the night over and over, every sound, every shadow, the way my heart raced when I saw the figure. I realized how vulnerable I had been, how small mistakes or bad timing could have cost me my life. I had planned carefully in terms of gear and supplies, but I hadn't considered human threats in the woods. The experience changed the way I approached the wilderness. I started taking self-defense seriously, learning how to move quietly, how to identify signs of human presence, and how to always have an escape plan. I never returned to that particular forest, but I continued hiking and camping, just with far more caution. I learned that the forest is not just a beautiful escape. It can be dangerous in ways you cannot predict. The peace I once associated with the woods became mixed with a deep respect and awareness. I still enjoy being in nature, but now I carry knowledge and caution alongside my backpack. I survived that night not because of luck alone, but because I stayed alert, thought clearly despite my fear, and moved carefully. The fear has never fully left me, but it has made me smarter, more aware, and ultimately, safer. The memory of that night will stay with me forever. A reminder that the wilderness demands respect, vigilance, and preparation beyond just tents, food, and fire. I had always loved camping alone. There was something about the quiet of the wilderness, the way the trees whispered with the wind, and the sense of being completely disconnected from everything that drew me to it. I had grown up with camping trips as a kid, always surrounded by family, but as I got older, I started seeking out more isolated spots, far from trails, far from anyone else. This time, I decided to head deep into a national forest that I had only read about in guidebooks. The trail maps suggested there were several primitive sites, places without even marked clearings, just areas where someone could set up a tent. I wanted one of those. I wanted the forest entirely to myself. I left my car early in the morning. The sun had barely started to rise, and the temperature was still crisp, the kind of cold that makes your skin tingle. I had packed light but thoroughly: a tent, a sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temperatures, a portable stove, water purification tablets, a small first aid kit, and enough dehydrated meals for a week. I didn't bring a phone. I didn't bring a GPS. I wanted the kind of experience where I had to rely entirely on my knowledge, my instincts, and my gear. I told myself that if anything went wrong, I could handle it. The forest was quiet at first, alive only with the sounds of birds waking up and the soft rustle of leaves. I hiked for hours, following a narrow stream to keep my bearings, avoiding the main trail. The air smelled earthy and damp, rich with the scent of moss and wet leaves. The further I went, the narrower the trail became, until it was more of a faint path than anything else. Branches scraped my backpack straps, and roots tripped me more than once. The forest thickened, the trees older and taller, their trunks twisted and gnarled. Every few minutes I would pause to listen. The wind had picked up slightly, and I could hear the branches creaking above me, the occasional distant snap of a branch falling. Around late afternoon, I finally found a small clearing. It wasn't a proper campsite, just a spot where the underbrush had thinned and the ground was relatively flat. Perfect. I dropped my pack and started setting up my tent, making sure the footprint was level, staking down the corners tightly. The sun was starting to dip below the treeline, casting long shadows across the clearing. It was beautiful in a quiet, ominous way. The forest seemed alive with unseen movement. I could hear small animals rustling in the brush, squirrels or rabbits, I assumed. Every so often, a bird of prey called from above, a high, sharp sound that echoed between the trees. After my tent was up, I set up my stove and boiled water for my first meal. I ate slowly, savoring the warmth and quiet, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction at being completely on my own. As the sun sank further, the forest darkened. Shadows deepened around the edges of the clearing, and the temperature dropped noticeably. I got into my sleeping bag inside the tent, reading my map by the light of a small headlamp, planning the route for the next day. I could hear the forest breathing outside. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, every distant bird made my skin prickle. By the time I tried to sleep, the darkness was thick. My tent felt small and fragile, and every sound outside seemed magnified. I reminded myself that everything out there was smaller than me, scared of me as much as I was of it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I would freeze and listen, convinced I heard footsteps crunching over dead leaves. But each time it was just my imagination, or so I told myself. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a different sound. It was a low, deliberate rustling, coming from the edge of the clearing. Not a small animal this time, something heavier. My heart rate spiked, and I stayed perfectly still, trying to listen. The rustling stopped and started again, slow and deliberate. I could hear the faint sound of breathing through the fabric of the tent. My mind raced. Bears were a possibility, although they usually avoided humans. Other campers could be out there, though unlikely given the remoteness. I slowly reached for my flashlight, careful not to make any sudden movement. The rustling continued, circling the clearing. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside without revealing my presence fully. My flashlight illuminated a tall, dark figure moving among the trees. It wasn't an animal. I could see it pause, crouch, and move again with cautious steps, like it was hunting something. I froze, realizing that I was the target. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to breathe slowly, thinking, running blindly into the forest would be suicide. My only chance was to stay calm and out of sight. I quietly reached for my bear spray and a small folding knife, just in case, and held my breath, trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible. The figure moved closer, stopping every few feet, listening. I could hear it sniffing the air. My mind refused to accept what it could be. Poacher? Someone looking for trouble? The forest offered so many places to hide that I considered crawling out the back of the tent and disappearing into the underbrush. But my body refused to move. Every instinct told me that if I made a sound, it would find me. The rustling paused, then started again, moving away slowly. I stayed still for what felt like hours, waiting, listening, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it could be heard outside the tent. Eventually, the forest returned to its normal rhythm. I could hear only the usual night sounds: crickets, the occasional rustle of small animals, the wind in the trees. But sleep was impossible. I stayed awake, holding my knife, listening. Dawn eventually crept through the trees, painting everything in pale gray. I left the tent cautiously, scanning the clearing. Nothing was there. No signs of human presence, no tracks, no evidence that anyone had been there besides me. Only my imagination, perhaps. By daylight, I decided to pack up. The forest that had been beautiful and inviting the day before now seemed hostile, full of unseen threats. I moved cautiously, sticking to the small stream I had followed the previous day. Hours passed. My mind kept replaying the previous night's events, and I realized that I was exhausted, stressed, and dehydrated despite my careful planning. I pushed on, taking small breaks to eat and drink, scanning every shadow. Around mid-afternoon, I stumbled upon a ranger station. It was small and mostly abandoned, with an overgrown path leading up to it. Relief washed over me. I knocked on the door, but no one was inside. Luckily, a phone box was attached to the building, and it was still working. I called the local forest rangers, explained the situation, and requested a ride back to the main road. They assured me they would send someone. While waiting, I inspected the area. The clearing where I had camped was visible from a small ridge near the station. I scanned it carefully and realized, with a sinking feeling, that the figure from last night had been more than just a person wandering the forest. The ground had faint footprints, too large and too deep for any normal person, and the spacing suggested long legs moving quickly. Whatever it had been following me, keeping out of sight but tracking me. I stayed near the station, every sense on high alert, until a ranger vehicle arrived. The ranger asked about my experience. I explained everything calmly, as best I could. They noted the footprints and confirmed my fear. In this part of the forest, there had been several reports of a man living illegally in the woods for years, sometimes following hikers, stealing supplies, and occasionally attacking people. The ranger admitted that encounters were rare, but the man was dangerous and unpredictable. They drove me back to my car slowly, scanning the surrounding forest. The entire time, I kept imagining those long, quiet movements, the rustling of branches, the pause of someone or something watching me. The forest, which had seemed inviting and serene just a day before, now felt like it had teeth. By the time I reached the parking lot, I was shaking, exhausted, and deeply shaken. Back in my car, I sat for a long time before starting the engine. I realized that the experience had changed me. I would still camp, still seek solitude, but I would never again underestimate how unpredictable the wilderness could be, nor how close danger could be without warning. My respect for the forest had deepened, and so had my caution. I drove home slowly, replaying every detail, knowing I would never forget the terror of that night. The silence, the rustling, and the unseen presence that had circled me while I lay helpless in my tent. From that day on, I always carried extra precautions. An emergency beacon, bear spray, a whistle, and I never camped completely alone in unknown areas. That night in the forest had been a terrifying reminder that wilderness, while beautiful, could be lethal if underestimated. I had survived, but only because of careful planning, patience, and a little luck. The forest had tested me, and I had walked away, wiser, more aware, and more cautious than ever before. I had been planning this camping trip for months, meticulously checking every piece of equipment, mapping every trail, and studying the terrain. I wanted solitude, a chance to escape the constant noise of the city, the bright lights, the relentless pressure of work. I had chosen a remote stretch of forest, far from the nearest road or human habitation, a place that promised quiet, fresh air, and the comfort of knowing that no one would intrude. I packed my backpack carefully. A tent, sleeping bag, stove, water filter, enough food for a week, first aid kit, compass, map, and a headlamp with extra batteries. Everything was checked and double-checked. Still, I couldn't shake a slight nervousness as I drove deeper into the wilderness. The city slowly disappeared behind me, replaced by dense clusters of trees, the road narrowing to a dirt track, uneven, pockmarked with stones and roots. The sun was high when I parked at a small clearing near a trailhead. There were no other cars, no signs of other campers. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, green and silent except for the occasional sound of birds or rustling leaves. I carried my backpack to a spot I had scouted on the map, a flat area near a small stream, shielded by thick trees. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the air smelled fresh, earthy, the scent of damp moss and decomposing leaves. I pitched my tent carefully, hammering the stakes into the ground and tightening the ropes to make sure it would hold against wind or rain. By the time I finished, sweat ran down my back, but a sense of satisfaction filled me. I set my stove, boiled water, prepared a simple meal of rice and canned beans, then washed up using the stream water filtered through my portable system. Everything was peaceful. The first night was quiet. I woke a few times to the sounds of the forest, twigs snapping under unseen animals, distant bird calls, but I felt safe. My flashlight illuminated the small clearing when I left the tent to check my surroundings. The moon cast a faint glow through the branches, and the forest seemed calm. I fell back asleep, my mind reassured by preparation and isolation. The next morning, I set out to explore deeper trails. The forest was dense, sunlight barely reaching the ground in patches. I moved carefully, following the marked trails, my boots crunching on dry leaves and pine needles. I passed old tree stumps, moss-covered rocks, and small wildlife. A fox darting into the underbrush, squirrels hopping between branches, birds flitting overhead. I took frequent breaks, drinking water, noting landmarks, enjoying the solitude. I walked for hours, feeling a sense of freedom I hadn't experienced in years. Around late afternoon, I decided to head back to camp. I had strayed farther than expected, and the sun was dipping lower, filtering through the trees in long golden streaks. The forest felt different at that hour, quieter, shadows stretching across the ground. I quickened my pace, following the trail, but soon realized that the path I had been following wasn't familiar. I had misread a junction. Panic started to creep in, not overwhelming, but noticeable. I stopped, checking my map and compass, trying to orient myself. The trail markers were sparse, some faded, some obscured by overgrown brush. I tried retracing my steps, but every turn seemed to look the same. As the sun sank lower, I felt a growing unease. The forest no longer felt welcoming. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence heavier. I began walking faster, calling out to see if anyone was nearby, though I knew the area was empty. My own voice sounded strange, swallowed by the vastness of the trees. I stumbled over roots, my legs aching, and I realized I had not brought a fully charged backup battery for my headlamp. The light was fading quickly. I reached a small clearing and decided to stop, catch my breath, and plan my next move. The stream I had seen earlier was nowhere in sight, and the terrain seemed unfamiliar. Anxiety began to mount, my heart pounding. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I had maps, a compass, food, and water. I had survival experience. I reminded myself to stay put and think. But I also knew that staying still without knowing where I was could mean a longer night in the dark forest. I considered climbing a hill nearby to get a better view, hoping to spot my campsite or a familiar landmark. The slope was steep, covered in loose rocks and branches, but I started climbing, careful with each step. My heart raced not from exertion alone but from fear, the fear of being lost in a vast forest with night approaching. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the top and looked around. The canopy stretched endlessly. I could see no signs of my campsite. The horizon was a blur of trees and shadows. Panic pressed against me, but I forced myself to breathe slowly, methodically. Night fell rapidly. The forest became a maze of black shapes, strange sounds echoing through the trees. I turned on my headlamp, its light cutting a small circle through the darkness. I could hear twigs snapping somewhere nearby, faint rustling. My imagination tried to fill in shapes, creatures, dangers, but I forced myself to focus on practical survival. I needed to find shelter. I couldn't risk wandering blindly in the dark. I spotted a small depression in the ground, partially covered by overhanging branches, offering some protection. It was not ideal, but it would keep me from being exposed. I cleared the ground of debris and set up a basic tarp over the area, improvising a small shelter. It wasn't a proper tent, but it would give me some protection from the cold and damp. I took inventory of my food and water, rationing what I had, knowing I might have to last longer than expected. The night was long. Every sound made me jump. Branches cracking, leaves rustling, animals moving unseen. I kept my knife close, my flashlight ready. I checked my compass and map repeatedly, trying to determine my position and the safest direction to travel once the sun rose. I realized that my attempts to retrace the trail had probably led me deeper into the forest instead of back toward the campsite. As dawn approached, a cold mist rolled in, dampening everything. Visibility was low. I debated whether to wait for the sun to rise fully or to start moving immediately. I decided I had to keep moving. Staying in one spot could be dangerous if I was not near water or shelter. I packed up my improvised shelter, slinging my backpack over my shoulders, and began walking cautiously, following the direction I hoped would lead me back to the stream I had used as a reference point. Hours passed. My muscles ached. My throat was dry, but I forced myself onward. I used every skill I had learned. Watching the sun's position, marking trees to avoid going in circles, listening for water. At one point, I heard the faint sound of running water. Relief surged through me. I veered toward it, careful not to lose the sound, and soon reached a small stream. I recognized it immediately. It was the same stream near my campsite. My heart leapt. Following the stream downhill, I eventually spotted the clearing where I had set up my tent. It looked untouched, as if no one had been there since I left. I collapsed onto the ground briefly, exhausted but immensely relieved. I drank water from the stream, filtered it, and sat in the shade, letting the sun warm me. The terror of being lost still lingered, but it had passed. I realized how fragile safety could be, how quickly it could disappear when alone in the wilderness. I spent the rest of the day reinforcing my campsite, creating a small signal with rocks and sticks in case of future emergencies, and resting. That night, I slept in my tent with renewed appreciation for preparation, awareness, and the simple safety of knowing where I was. I reflected on the lessons learned: respect for nature, humility in the face of isolation, and the need for careful planning, even when confident. The experience left me shaken but wiser, and when I packed up to leave the next day, I felt gratitude for the forest's beauty and my survival. The trip ended without incident after that. I returned to civilization, carrying memories of fear, solitude, and resilience. I shared none of it with anyone for a long time, understanding that some experiences are too intimate, too raw, to be diluted by storytelling. But I never forgot the sound of the forest at night, the twisting shadows, and the quiet triumph of finding my way back. That experience changed the way I approached planning, caution, and respect for wilderness, the stark, relentless reality of being truly alone in nature. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea was simple: a solo camping trip deep in the mountains, far from towns, roads, and any sign of civilization. I wanted nothing but the raw experience of nature. Woods, rivers, cliffs, and the night sky untouched by city lights. I had picked a remote area in the northern part of the state, a place that was rugged, mostly unvisited, and had a reputation for being dangerous if unprepared. I told myself I was ready. I told myself I could handle it. But nothing had prepared me for what was coming. I arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon, carrying a pack that weighed more than I realized until I slung it over my shoulders. It was full: a tent, a sleeping bag, extra clothes, a stove, enough food for 4 days, water bottles, a first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, a small hatchet, and a detailed map of the area. The trailhead was quiet, almost too quiet. Only the sound of the wind moving through the pine trees, the distant chirp of a bird, and the occasional rustle of small animals broke the silence. The air smelled sharp and clean, tinged with the scent of pine resin and damp earth. The first few miles were easy. The trail was wide and fairly well kept. I walked briskly, enjoying the weight of the pack as a reminder that I was alive, that I was out here alone, testing myself. Sunlight streamed through the trees, and the shadows moved quickly with the passing clouds. The forest was dense, yet open enough to let me see 50 or 60 feet ahead. I kept glancing at the map, marking my progress, noting small landmarks like fallen trees, rock formations, and the curve of the river that I was following. By late afternoon, the trail narrowed, and the trees grew taller and more closely packed. The light dimmed under the thick canopy, and the sound of the wind became a steady whisper. The ground was uneven, strewn with rocks, roots, and fallen branches. I had to step carefully, keeping my pace slow but steady. Somewhere ahead, a small creek crossed the trail, the water running fast over smooth stones. I filled one of my bottles, drinking greedily and savoring the icy water. It was sharp and refreshing, and it reminded me that the forest was alive, independent of my presence, indifferent to my plans. I found a small clearing about a mile past the creek. It was perfect for setting up camp, flat with soft earth covered in pine needles. I set down my pack and began unpacking. I hammered in the tent stakes, rolled out the sleeping bag, and arranged my gear so that everything was within reach. By the time I finished, the sun was low in the sky, filtering through the trees in long golden beams. I had just enough daylight to start a fire. I gathered dry wood, kindling, and twigs, stacking them carefully in a small pile. After a few attempts, I managed to get a flame going. The fire crackled and hissed, sending sparks into the air. I cooked a simple dinner, canned beans and rice heated over the flames. The smell of food and smoke filled the clearing. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, enjoying the warmth of the fire against the coming cold. The shadows were lengthening, and the forest around me began to change. The soft rustle of leaves became more noticeable. The occasional snap of a branch under a small animal's foot echoed in the quiet. I felt a flicker of unease, a prickling sensation along my spine, but I told myself it was just nerves. I was alone, but not in danger. Not yet. As darkness fell, the forest became a different place. Shapes shifted in the firelight, and every sound seemed amplified. I kept the fire going, though it was small, just enough to illuminate my immediate surroundings. The wind whispered through the trees, and I could hear the creek babbling in the distance. I noticed something moving just at the edge of the firelight, a flash of fur, a shadow darting between the trees. I froze, heart racing, but it never came closer. After a long while, it disappeared entirely, leaving only the wind and the rustling leaves. I tried to sleep, but I could not. The forest seemed alive, watching, waiting. Every crack, every snap, every rustle made me sit up and strain my eyes into the darkness. Hours passed, the fire burning low, and I kept checking my knife and flashlight, making sure they were within reach. The temperature dropped sharply as midnight approached, and I could see my breath in the cold air. That night, I heard something I had not expected, a sound unlike any normal animal. A deep, guttural growl, followed by a series of heavy footsteps approaching through the underbrush. My heart jumped into my throat. I reached for my flashlight, shaking, and swept it across the clearing. Nothing, but the footsteps continued, heavy, deliberate, coming closer. I realized then that this was no small animal. A bear, maybe, a mountain lion, something large and strong, and it was curious about me. I stayed perfectly still, trying to make myself as small as possible. My mind raced with possibilities. If it was a bear, I had no way to defend myself except noise, my fire, and the small hatchet. If it was a mountain lion, I had even less chance. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and I held my breath. Then a branch snapped closer, and a low growl came again. I fumbled for my flashlight, finally turning it on and pointing it toward the sound. The beam caught something moving, a massive shape with dark fur, circling the fire. Fear took over completely. I knew I could not run. Running would trigger a chase instinct and I would lose. I had read about bear encounters, about how dangerous they could be. I remembered the advice. Stay calm, make yourself appear larger, make noise, back away slowly if possible. But the firelight was all I had, and the thing, whatever it was, kept moving just at the edge, never fully stepping into the light. I tried to make myself bigger, standing up and waving my arms, shouting and banging a stick against the ground. The creature flinched, then retreated slightly, moving back into the shadows. I kept the fire between us, feeding it more wood, making it larger and brighter. The growls faded, replaced by occasional snapping and rustling in the underbrush. I could not tell if it had left or was simply hiding, waiting. My entire body was shaking, but I forced myself to stay awake, tending the fire, checking my perimeter, and listening. Hours passed, the forest slowly changing as the first light of dawn filtered through the trees. I had barely slept, my body exhausted but my mind alert. When the sun fully rose, the shadows retreated, and I could see more clearly. I inspected the area around my campsite and found deep tracks in the soft soil, enormous claw marks on nearby trees. Whatever had visited me in the night had been massive, far larger than any animal I had expected. I was shaken but alive, and the experience made me painfully aware of how small and vulnerable I was in the wilderness. I packed up quickly, my hands trembling, and followed the trail back toward the main path. The forest looked different in the light of day, less threatening, more alive, but the memory of the night's encounter stayed with me. I moved as fast as I could, careful to keep an eye on my surroundings. Every shadow, every movement, every bird call reminded me that I was still in the domain of something far larger than myself. By the afternoon, I reached a larger clearing where the trail opened to a small valley. I could hear the distant hum of a road, a sound that felt like civilization and safety. I moved toward it, scanning the woods constantly, but nothing appeared. Eventually, I saw a hiker in the distance, a person who seemed real and solid. Relief washed over me. I approached, exhausted, hands shaking, but finally found someone else. Someone who could reassure me that the forest I had navigated alone was not a place for complacency. We walked together back to the nearest trailhead, talking quietly as I recounted some of my experience. I could see the disbelief in their eyes, but also the respect, the understanding of what it meant to be truly alone in the wilderness, facing something massive and unknown. When we finally reached the parking lot, I collapsed into my car seat, exhausted but profoundly grateful. I had survived. I had endured the fear, the isolation, and the raw danger of being alone in the mountains. That night, I slept in a motel, every sound outside amplified in my exhausted mind, but I was safe. The forest, the creature, the night itself haunted me, but it also taught me a lesson I would carry forever. Preparation, awareness, and respect for nature are not optional. They are essential. And I had lived to tell the story, shaken but stronger, alive and wiser, knowing that the wilderness does not forgive carelessness, but it rewards vigilance and respect. From that trip onward, I never underestimated the mountains, never assumed the forest was tame. I carried every detail of that night in my mind. The growls, the shadows, the firelight flickering against massive fur, because it reminded me that survival is never guaranteed, but it is possible when one respects the world they step into. I returned to the same forest years later, better prepared, wiser, and still cautious, knowing that the wilderness does not change, but humans can learn, adapt, and survive. I had planned this camping trip for weeks, making sure I had every piece of gear I thought I might need. I wanted to spend a few days alone in the forest, away from the city, away from the constant noise, and just be with myself and the wilderness. I packed my old, reliable backpack with everything: a tent, sleeping bag, portable stove, water filter, enough food for 3 days, a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, a map, a compass, and a small folding knife. I even brought a book, though I wasn't sure if I would have the mental space to read. I arrived at the trailhead in the late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dirt road. The parking area was empty except for one rusty pickup truck far down the line. I tightened my boots, slung the backpack onto my shoulders, and checked my map. The trail I had chosen was a loop, meant to take me deep into the forest and back by nightfall the following day. The first few hours of hiking were peaceful. The air was cool but not cold, the smell of damp earth and pine filling my lungs with every breath. Birds called from high branches, squirrels darted across fallen logs, and a creek gurgled nearby. I felt the familiar calm of being in the wild, the nervous tension of city life slowly falling away with every step. The trail climbed steadily, but it wasn't overly difficult. My pack felt heavy, but manageable, and I kept a steady pace, stopping occasionally to drink water or rest my shoulders. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a ridge that gave me a broad view of the valley below. Sunlight spilled over the treetops, golden and warm. I stopped for a while, sitting on a flat rock and eating a small snack. I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in months. Then I got up, stretched my legs, and continued on the path. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing with soft ground surrounded by thick pine trees. It seemed like a perfect spot to set up camp. I checked the map again. It matched up perfectly with the trail. I unpacked my gear and started setting up the tent. I was careful to pick a spot away from any obvious hazards: loose rocks, dead trees, or steep drop-offs. Once the tent was up, I collected firewood, gathering branches and dry twigs for a small fire. The forest floor was covered with needles and leaves, and the scent of pine sap was strong. I arranged the wood carefully and got a small flame going with matches I had brought. As night approached, the temperature dropped sharply. I added more logs to the fire, watching the flames dance and the shadows stretch long across the clearing. The sounds of the forest changed too. Birds were quiet now, and the calls of nocturnal animals began. I heard the distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, and the steady whisper of wind through the trees. I felt alone but safe, reassured by the circle of firelight. I cooked a simple dinner over the flames, feeling the warmth in my hands and the glow on my face. After eating, I cleaned up, putting all food scraps and wrappers into a small bag to hang from a tree branch. Bears weren't common in this area, but I didn't want to take any risks. I sat for a while, staring into the fire, thinking about how quiet the forest had become. Darkness was complete now, except for the fire and the stars overhead. Then I heard it, a faint snap of a twig, just beyond the firelight. I froze, straining to see through the trees. It was probably just a deer or another small animal, I told myself, trying to remain calm. But then another sound came, a deliberate crack, like someone stepping on a thick branch. My pulse quickened. I glanced at the flashlight, thinking of turning it on, but hesitated. I didn't want to draw attention to myself unnecessarily. I slowly unzipped the tent flap and peeked out. The firelight fell on nothing but trees, shadows shifting with the flames. I heard it again, a low, deliberate rustling in the underbrush. I knew then it wasn't a deer or a squirrel. This was larger. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Something was moving closer, and it wasn't moving erratically. It was deliberate, patient, aware of me. My mind raced. I had no phone signal, no way to call for help. My pack contained a knife, but I didn't want to engage in close combat unless I had to. I considered staying perfectly still and waiting for whatever was to pass. But then I realized that might not work. If it was a human, staying put might make me a target. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the tent quietly. The fire was still burning, casting weak light, but it wouldn't reach far into the thick forest. I took a careful step, then another, trying to make myself as small and non-threatening as possible, while keeping my eyes on the shadows. Then I saw movement. A figure, crouched low, moving between the trees. I couldn't make out details, but the shape was humanoid. I swallowed hard and backed away slowly toward my backpack, trying to stay calm. My mind raced for options. I could try to outrun it, but with the terrain and the pack, I wasn't confident. I could yell, but that might provoke it. Then I remembered the bear spray in my pack. I fumbled for it, trying not to make noise. The figure had stopped now, only a few meters from the clearing. I raised the spray, my hands trembling, trying to ready myself for a sudden attack. It stayed still for a long moment, and then, to my surprise, it turned and ran away into the darkness. My heart didn't slow immediately. I stayed on high alert, scanning the trees for any sign of it returning. I spent the rest of the night awake, sitting close to the fire, fully dressed, with the knife and bear spray ready. Every rustle of leaves, every distant sound made me flinch. I didn't sleep, not even for a minute. I didn't want to close my eyes and risk being caught unaware. When dawn finally came, pale and gray, I was exhausted, my body stiff, but relieved to see the forest in full light. I packed my gear quickly, scanning the surroundings constantly. The clearing was empty now. Whatever had been there the night before had disappeared. I decided to hike back immediately instead of continuing deeper into the forest. My pace was brisk, my eyes never leaving the trail. Every shadow and every sound made me tense, but the daylight was comforting. By midday, I reached the trailhead, sweaty, tired, and shaken. I saw other people in the parking area now, hikers with their own packs and dogs. I felt a wave of relief just seeing them, knowing there were other people nearby. I got into my car, locked the doors, and sat for a long time, just breathing and trying to calm my nerves. After a while, I reviewed everything that had happened. I realized I had been lucky. The figure in the forest could have been a criminal or someone with bad intentions, but it could also have been a lost hiker. Either way, I knew I had to be more careful in the future. Choosing camping spots closer to well-trafficked trails, hiking with companions, and always having a reliable way to call for help. The experience left a mark on me. I loved the forest, the solitude, and the adventure, but I understood now how vulnerable I could be in the wild, even in a place that seemed safe. I didn't stop camping after that, but I changed my approach entirely. I started carrying extra protection, choosing busier trails, and always letting someone know exactly where I would be. That trip, terrifying as it was, taught me a lot about caution, awareness, and respect for both the wilderness and the unpredictability of human behavior. When I look back, I remember the fear, the adrenaline, and the relief, but also the clarity that comes with surviving a truly dangerous situation. I made it out safe, and that became my measure of success, more than any scenic view or sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just about camping anymore. It was about being alive, alert, and prepared, and carrying that lesson with me for every adventure that followed. I had planned this solo camping trip for months, carefully choosing a spot deep in the forest where I could be alone, far from roads, far from people, and completely immersed in nature. I had always been drawn to the quiet isolation of the wilderness. I liked being cut off from everything, hearing only the wind and the birds and the distant rustle of leaves. This time, I had chosen a small clearing near a stream, a spot I had found on old maps and confirmed using satellite images. I packed my gear meticulously. A lightweight tent, sleeping bag, camping stove, enough food for a week, a first aid kit, plenty of water, and a small hunting knife strapped to my belt. I also had a bear spray and a flashlight with extra batteries. Safety was always on my mind, even if I enjoyed pushing the limits of solitude. The first day of hiking into the forest was exhausting but invigorating. The trail started narrow and worn, with roots protruding from the soil and rocks jutting sharply at odd angles. I had to focus constantly on where I placed my feet, balancing my backpack and keeping my eyes on the path ahead. The sun filtered through the tall pines, casting long shadows that shifted as the day passed. Birds called intermittently from the canopy, and I caught glimpses of squirrels darting up tree trunks. The smell of pine and damp earth filled the air, a mixture that was strangely comforting, almost intoxicating in its rawness. Every step deeper into the forest felt like leaving civilization behind, like stepping into a world entirely my own. By mid-afternoon, I reached a point where the trail seemed to end, or perhaps it had simply faded into the undergrowth. I had prepared for this, expecting to navigate some unmarked paths to reach my chosen clearing. I consulted my map and compass, and soon I found a small path leading toward the stream I had seen in satellite images. The forest thickened here. The ground was uneven, covered with fallen leaves, twigs, and loose stones. Every so often, I had to push aside branches and vines, scratching my arms despite wearing long sleeves. The further I went, the quieter the forest became. Even the birds seemed to disappear. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was low, casting a golden glow that made the clearing appear almost magical in its serenity. I set up my tent quickly, choosing a flat area a few meters from the stream, but far enough to avoid any chance of flooding if the water rose overnight. The clearing was small but sufficient. I cleared the ground of sharp rocks and sticks, spreading out my sleeping bag inside the tent. Once the tent was secure, I collected some firewood. Dead branches scattered around the clearing, dry enough to light easily. Starting a fire was always a ritual for me. I arranged the twigs carefully, lit a small flame and watched it grow, feeding it larger sticks until it roared softly. The crackling sound of the fire mixed with the gentle babbling of the stream nearby, creating a strange sense of peace, a calm before the tension I knew solitude could bring. That night, I slept lightly, the unfamiliar sounds of the forest keeping me half alert. Every rustle, every snap of a twig, made my senses sharpen. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a strange sound, a soft, irregular thumping coming from just beyond the clearing. My heart raced as I tried to pinpoint it. It didn't sound like a deer or a rabbit. It was heavier, slower, deliberate. I lay still, listening, straining my eyes in the darkness beyond the tent's thin walls. My flashlight was within reach, and my knife felt heavier in my grip than during the day. The thumping continued intermittently, moving closer. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal, perhaps a bear, or worse, another human. But I hadn't seen any tracks near the clearing, no sign of anyone else in days. Still, the sound grew more distinct, more unnervingly methodical. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear branches breaking under careful weight, faint crunches in the underbrush. My pulse pounded, and I realized I had never felt so exposed in my life, alone with nothing but thin nylon walls between me and the forest. The night dragged on. Every few minutes, the sound came again, always moving just at the edge of visibility. I tried to rationalize it. Small animals, perhaps, or the wind, but my instincts screamed otherwise. By dawn, the thumping had stopped. I stepped out cautiously, knife in hand, scanning the surrounding trees. Nothing appeared out of place. The forest looked peaceful again, but the night had left its mark. My hands were still trembling, my nerves frayed from the tension. I packed up quickly, determined to hike farther that morning. The experience had reminded me that being alone in the forest wasn't just peaceful. It was unpredictable, and survival often meant vigilance. The next few days were a mix of routine and heightened awareness. I moved cautiously, avoiding dense areas where I couldn't see far ahead, keeping my knife ready and my bear spray close. I fished from the stream, cooked simple meals over the fire, and tried to maintain normalcy. Yet the memory of that night lingered. Every sound, the splash of water, the crack of a branch, set my nerves on edge. My sleep remained shallow, and I found myself waking at odd hours, scanning the shadows, imagining figures that weren't there. The forest had transformed from a place of peace to one of constant tension. On the 4th day, I decided to explore a narrow path that led upstream. The path was steep and rocky, with loose soil threatening to slip under my boots. The air was cooler here, the canopy denser, making it darker even at noon. I moved slowly, planting my feet carefully, stopping frequently to listen. The stream grew louder as I ascended, the sound echoing against the rocks and trees. Eventually, I reached a small waterfall feeding a natural pool. The sight was breathtaking, the water clear and cold, reflecting the sunlight that managed to penetrate the dense forest canopy. I sat on a rock nearby, eating my lunch, feeling a fragile sense of calm wash over me. As I prepared to leave, I noticed something odd on the ground near the water's edge. Tracks, too large for a deer, too precise for a wild animal. They were human footprints. They weren't fresh, but recent enough to make my heart race. My mind began running scenarios. How long had someone been in this part of the forest? Had they seen me? Were they aware of my presence? I scanned the surrounding trees, but no one appeared. The forest seemed silent, almost too quiet. I debated whether to follow the trail or return to my campsite, but instinct urged caution. I marked the location in my mind and retraced my steps back to the tent, careful to move quietly and remain alert. That night, sleep was impossible. Every sound outside the tent felt amplified. Leaves rustled under weight, branches snapped in the distance, and I could swear I heard footsteps circling the clearing. I kept the flashlight and knife close, ready to defend myself if necessary. Hours passed, each minute stretching endlessly. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I dozed lightly, my body tense, ready to spring at any sign of danger. The following morning, I made a decision. I packed up everything meticulously, leaving no trace of my presence, and began the long hike back toward civilization. Every step was careful, every sound examined. I avoided the tracks I had found upstream, choosing instead to move through denser undergrowth where I could see potential threats. Hunger, fatigue, and tension weighed on me, but determination kept me moving. Hours passed, the sun rose higher, and finally, I glimpsed the familiar markings of the main trail. Relief flooded me. I stayed alert but allowed myself a small measure of comfort. The forest behind me was quiet, the danger left there with the trees and shadows. By late afternoon, I emerged onto a wide dirt road leading toward the nearest ranger station. I stopped to catch my breath, feeling the tension in my shoulders slowly release. My legs ached from constant hiking, and my hands were sore from gripping my backpack and knife for days. The ranger station appeared ahead, a simple wooden building with a small parking area. I approached cautiously, but as I drew near, I realized I was safe. People moved about, checking supplies, recording reports, and going about their day. The normalcy was overwhelming after days of tension, isolation, and fear. I handed over my maps and explained the tracks I had found. The rangers nodded, taking notes and offering advice. They reassured me that I had made the right decision by leaving when I did and reminded me of the risks of solo hiking in remote areas. I stayed at the ranger station for the night, sleeping in a real bed for the first time in nearly a week. The sound of the wind, the forest, the animals. It was replaced by the hum of lights, occasional footsteps, and distant voices. I felt a strange gratitude for the comfort, but also a lingering respect for the forest and the unpredictability of being truly alone in the wild. I had learned firsthand the necessity of caution, awareness, and preparation. That camping trip, terrifying as it had been, had taught me more about survival, instincts, and my own limits than any peaceful hike ever could. In the days that followed, I returned home, still feeling the forest's presence in my mind. I shared the story with close friends, careful to emphasize the realistic dangers, the human tracks, the unnerving nights. It wasn't a story of ghosts or fantasy. It was a story of the real risks of isolation, of encountering the unknown, of being alone and vulnerable. The fear I experienced stayed with me for weeks, surfacing whenever I walked through quiet, dark areas or heard rustling in the distance. Yet, alongside the fear was pride. Pride in facing danger, in surviving, in making rational decisions under stress. That trip changed the way I approached nature, solitude, and life itself. Even months later, I find myself thinking back to the stream, the waterfall, the clearing, and the footprints. I remember every detail: the smell of wet pine, the texture of rocks under my hands, the crackle of the fire, the sound of footsteps in the darkness. And I know that while fear is powerful, careful preparation, awareness, and respect for nature can carry you through the scariest experiences. That trip, though terrifying at times, ended not with tragedy but with clarity, resilience, and a profound understanding of both danger and survival. I returned from the forest with my life intact, my body bruised but capable, my mind sharper, and my appreciation for simple safety measures and preparedness deeper than ever. That experience stayed with me forever, a reminder that the real terror in the wilderness comes not from shadows or myths, but from human unpredictability and the raw, untamed reality of nature itself. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. My work schedule had been relentless, leaving me mentally exhausted and craving a break in the outdoors. I decided to take a solo trip to a state forest I had read about online. It was a remote place, the kind of forest where you could walk for miles without seeing another human being. I packed my gear carefully: a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag, a compact stove, water filters, canned food, a first aid kit, and a small axe. I also packed a map and compass, not fully trusting my phone's GPS in a heavily wooded area. The drive to the trailhead was long, taking me over winding country roads and past fields that stretched farther than the eye could see. By the time I arrived, the sun was already low, painting the sky in soft orange and pink hues. I parked my car in a small clearing and unloaded my pack, slinging it over my shoulders and taking my first steps on the dirt trail. The forest was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Birds chirped intermittently, and the wind rustled through the trees, but there were no other sounds. The trail was narrow, and in some places the underbrush pressed against my legs as I walked. I found myself scanning the forest floor, noticing broken branches, animal tracks, and the occasional patch of mushrooms or moss. Everything seemed normal, but there was a subtle tension in the air I couldn't shake, a feeling that the forest itself was watching. After about an hour of walking, I found a small clearing beside a stream. It was perfect for setting up camp. Flat ground, access to water, and enough trees nearby to offer some wind protection but not so dense as to feel closed in. I pitched my tent carefully, hammering stakes into the ground and double-checking that it was secure. Once the tent was up, I unpacked my stove and started boiling water for my dinner. The sound of the water bubbling and the aroma of cooking food brought a small sense of comfort in the otherwise isolated environment. As darkness fell, the forest changed. Shadows stretched long across the clearing, and the wind seemed to whisper through the trees. I decided to take a short walk along the stream before bed, partly to stretch my legs and partly to enjoy the solitude. The water was cold and clear, moving over smooth stones with a steady murmur. I followed the stream for a few hundred feet, observing the way the moonlight glimmered on the surface and how the shadows shifted between the trees. It was peaceful, almost serene, until I realized I could no longer hear the distant rustle of leaves or the occasional bird. Even the water seemed quieter. I returned to my tent, brushing off the uneasy feeling that had crept into my chest. I reminded myself that this was just the natural stillness of the forest at night, that there was nothing unusual about it. I crawled into my sleeping bag, trying to relax. I had my headlamp and my small knife within reach, just in case, but I told myself it was paranoia. Sleep came slowly. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a noise outside my tent. It wasn't loud, just a soft, dragging sound, like something heavy moving across the ground. My heart started pounding. I stayed perfectly still, straining to listen. The sound repeated, irregular, coming closer and then stopping. I could hear the crunch of twigs underfoot and something brushing against the undergrowth. It was faint, but distinct enough to make my stomach knot with tension. I considered unzipping the tent to see what it was, but a sudden thought made me hesitate. There were wild animals in this forest: bears, coyotes, maybe even mountain lions. My small knife would do nothing against them. I stayed quiet, trying to remember everything I had read about avoiding dangerous encounters. Stay calm, make yourself appear larger, and don't run blindly. The noise continued for what felt like an eternity. It was slow, methodical, like something or someone was searching for me. My breathing became shallow, my hands sweaty. I realized that the wind had stopped entirely. There was a strange, heavy silence that made the forest feel even more oppressive. I tried to stay still, hoping whatever it was would move on. But then I heard a branch snap very close to my tent. It was a loud crack, sharp and sudden. My heart leapt into my throat. Whatever it was right there. I reached for my headlamp, holding it above my head as I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the clearing in a narrow circle. First, I saw nothing. Then, a shadow moved at the edge of the light. I froze. It was a human shape, crouched low, moving carefully. My mind raced. I was alone, far from help. There was no way to know if this person was dangerous or not, but instinct screamed that they were. I quickly thought of my options. I could run to my car, but it was at least a 15-minute sprint over uneven terrain in the dark. I could hide in the tent, but that wouldn't stop someone determined from finding me. I remembered the small axe I had packed and grabbed it. If this person tried to get inside my tent, I would have to fight. My hands shook as I held it, the metal cold and heavy. The figure froze, as if sensing my light. I held my breath. It moved again, slowly, keeping to the shadows and disappearing from the circle of my headlamp. I realized that it might just be scouting, looking for an easy target. My stomach churned. I tried to recall the layout of the clearing, noting the trees and underbrush that could provide some cover. I knew I had to get to my car without being seen. I waited until I was sure the figure had moved further away, then quietly unzipped the tent and slipped out. I kept low, moving from tree to tree, trying to use the shadows as cover. My backpack was heavy, slowing me down, and every snap of a twig made my heart jump. I counted each step carefully, trying to memorize the sounds I made and avoid making sudden noise. The forest seemed alive with every creak and rustle, and I kept imagining the figure was right behind me. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, I saw the dim outline of my car through the trees. Relief surged through me. I sprinted the last few meters, throwing open the door and sliding inside. I locked the doors and leaned against the steering wheel, trembling. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. I glanced around, half expecting to see the figure emerge from the trees, but the clearing was empty. I decided not to wait and see what would happen. I drove slowly along the dirt road, keeping my headlights on and scanning the edges of the forest. The road twisted and turned, but eventually I reached the main road, the kind that other cars might travel on. My hands were stiff from gripping the wheel, and my legs ached, but I forced myself to stay alert. I could still hear my heart pounding in my ears, and every shadow in the trees made me tense. I stopped at a small gas station when I reached civilization. The fluorescent lights and the hum of the refrigerators felt almost unreal after the oppressive darkness of the forest. I bought a large bottle of water and a snack, trying to calm myself. I considered calling the police, but without knowing exactly where I had been or what had happened, I wasn't sure what to say. I realized that I had been lucky, that whatever or whoever had been outside my tent had moved on without harming me. I drove home slowly, taking the long route through well-lit roads. When I finally reached my apartment, I parked and sat in the car for a long time, just breathing and letting the tension drain from my body. I checked my gear and everything was in place. Nothing had been stolen or damaged. I realized how easy it could have been for the night to end very differently if I had made one wrong move, if the figure had been braver, or if I had panicked. Over the next few days, I thought back to the forest constantly. The memory of that crouched figure, moving silently through the shadows, stayed with me. I replayed every moment, analyzing what I could have done differently, but I also felt a strange sense of gratitude. I had made it out unharmed, and I had done so by staying calm, thinking carefully, and moving strategically. The forest had tested me, and I had survived. I never returned to that campsite. I researched reports of missing hikers and break-ins, realizing that people did sometimes venture into remote areas for criminal reasons, not just for wildlife encounters. That knowledge didn't make me feel safer, but it did help me understand the reality of the situation. I started taking extra precautions on every hike and camping trip, letting someone know my exact route, carrying more robust self-defense tools, and choosing locations closer to populated areas. The experience changed the way I approached the outdoors. I still loved camping, still craved the solitude and beauty of nature, but I approached it with a respect for the unpredictability of the real world. The forest was beautiful, but it was also dangerous, and the danger wasn't always obvious. I carried the memory of that night as a warning, but also as a reminder of my own resilience. Eventually, I returned to camping, but always with more preparation, more awareness, and a sense that I could never take the forest for granted again. I never saw the figure again, and I never fully understood who or what it was. But the experience taught me something crucial. Staying calm, staying aware, and trusting your instincts can make the difference between life and something far worse. Even now, when I think back to that night, I can feel the cold bite of fear, the weight of being alone in the dark, and the adrenaline that kept me moving. It is a memory that never fades, not because it was supernatural or magical, but because it was real, raw, and terrifyingly human. The forest had tested me, and I had survived, leaving me with a story I will carry for the rest of my life. I had been planning this camping trip for months, the way a person plans something they think will be peaceful and simple, not knowing how quickly it can turn dangerous. I had chosen a remote spot deep in the mountains, far from any roads or towns, because I wanted complete solitude. The place was supposed to be perfect. A small clearing near a narrow stream, surrounded by tall pine trees and steep rock formations. The map I had studied for weeks showed a trail that would take me to the site over the course of a few hours. But what the map did not show was the isolation, the silence, or the feeling of being completely exposed in the middle of nowhere. I set out in the late morning, carrying a heavy backpack filled with supplies. A tent, sleeping bag, a portable stove, food for 3 days, extra water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a few tools like a small hatchet and a multi-purpose knife. The trail was narrow and rugged, winding through dense forest, and I had to push branches aside and step over roots constantly. At first, it felt invigorating, the kind of tiredness that makes the body feel alive. Birds called from the trees, squirrels darted across the trail, and the air was fresh and crisp. I felt good, confident that I was prepared for whatever the wilderness could throw at me. By mid-afternoon, I had reached the clearing. The stream was smaller than I had expected, just a thin trickle of water that shimmered in the late sunlight. I set down my backpack and began to unpack and organize. I found a flat area to pitch the tent, clearing away pine needles and small stones. The ground was uneven, but I managed to get it secure. I set up the stove and boiled water for some dehydrated food. I took my time, making sure everything was in order, because I knew that once darkness fell, moving around would be much more difficult and dangerous. The first night was quiet. I had a small fire going, the smell of smoke mixing with the scent of pine and damp earth. I sat near it, watching the flickering flames, listening to the soft gurgle of the stream and the occasional call of an owl. I felt a certain comfort in the solitude. I reminded myself constantly to stay alert, but the calm of the wilderness lulled me into a kind of false security. As the night deepened, I went to sleep in my tent, hearing nothing but the faint rustling of leaves and the distant sound of running water. The next morning, I woke early. The air was colder than I expected, and frost had formed on the grass near the stream. I had planned to hike further along a ridge that overlooked the valley, hoping to see the mountains in the distance. I packed a small day bag with water, snacks, a map, compass, and my knife, leaving the larger pack in the tent. The hike started easy enough. The trail was less clear in places, overgrown with brush and fallen trees, but I moved slowly and carefully, making sure to mark my path in case I needed to return. By late morning, I reached a narrow ridge. The view was breathtaking, layers of mountains stretching into the horizon, their peaks shrouded in mist. But the ridge was dangerous. Loose rocks and uneven ground made every step risky. I carefully tested each foothold, my heart pounding not just from the exertion but from the awareness of how easily an accident could happen here. After taking some photos, I decided to head back to camp before the weather changed. Clouds had begun to gather, and the wind picked up suddenly, making the trees sway violently. It was on the way back that I first noticed something was off. I heard a snapping of a branch behind me, and when I turned, nothing was there. I told myself it was probably an animal or my own imagination, the sound amplified by the wind. But as I continued down the trail, I began to hear more. Faint crunching of leaves, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind. I stopped frequently to listen, but each time I found no one. A part of me was growing anxious, a small voice in the back of my mind warning me that I might not be alone. By the time I returned to my campsite, the sky was dark with heavy clouds. I hurried to set up a fire, wanting light and warmth. The wind howled, making the branches above creak and groan. I secured the tent flaps tightly, making sure nothing could get inside, and sat as close to the fire as I could without burning myself. The night felt different than the first one. There was a constant feeling of being watched, and every shadow cast by the fire seemed to move on its own. It was around midnight when I first heard the heavy footsteps. They were deliberate, slow, and close, crunching through the pine needles. I froze, listening. They didn't sound like an animal. My heart began to race. I grabbed my knife and held it ready, moving quietly toward the tent opening to peek out. The firelight flickered across the trees, and I could see nothing. Then I heard a voice, low and muffled, but I couldn't make out the words. My first instinct was to stay hidden. I had no idea who or what was out there. The footsteps continued for hours. They would circle the clearing, moving closer, then retreating. I stayed in the tent, clutching my knife, trying to remain calm. I thought about the survival guides I had read, the ones that said never to confront an unknown threat unless absolutely necessary. I rationed my energy, keeping my mind focused on practical things. Checking the fire, listening to the wind, counting the minutes. Every small sound seemed amplified, every shadow suspicious. The fear became almost physical, a weight pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. By morning, the footsteps had stopped, but the sense of danger remained. I didn't sleep much. The wind had calmed, but the trees still swayed, and the distant call of an animal echoed in the valley below. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things quickly, leaving some non-essential items behind, and set out down the trail as soon as the first light broke through the clouds. The hike back was tense. I moved quickly, watching every shadow, listening for any unusual sound. I stayed on the trail, but at several points, I had to navigate steep drops and fallen trees, making the journey exhausting. Hours passed, and the fear never left me. I thought constantly about what could have been out there, who might have been watching, and why they hadn't approached me directly. I kept telling myself I would reach the road, the place where I could see people and cars in safety. By late afternoon, I reached the edge of the forest where the trail met a dirt road. Relief hit me like a wave. I ran the last few meters, not caring about my scraped legs or tired feet. There was a small ranger station nearby, and I found someone there. I explained my location and situation briefly, showing the map and pointing to the trail. The ranger nodded, listening carefully, then radioed for a patrol to check the area. I stayed there until sunset, too exhausted and anxious to move. The patrol came the next morning. They searched the area thoroughly, finding no one, but they discovered signs that someone had been camping in my clearing recently. Remnants of a small fire, discarded food wrappers, and footprints that didn't match mine. The ranger told me it was likely a person who had been hiding, watching, maybe even following me. I realized how lucky I had been to avoid direct confrontation. I didn't return to that forest for years. The experience stayed with me, not as a memory of natural beauty or adventure, but as a lesson in caution, awareness, and the unpredictable danger of isolation. When I finally camped again, it was always near other people, in designated areas, with the knowledge that the wilderness can be unforgiving and that some threats are human, not wild animals. The fear I felt that night never completely went away, but it became part of the respect I now carried for the mountains. Looking back, I understood how small mistakes could have turned into disaster. Not checking for signs of other people on the trail, trusting my sense of security too easily, leaving without signaling my plans to anyone. Each could have cost me my life, but I survived. I had been careful, alert, and willing to act quickly when necessary. And in the end, I returned home safe, carrying only the memory of a night that felt like the wilderness itself was alive, watching, and reminding me that solitude can be beautiful, but also terrifying. I never camped alone in a remote area again. I learned to respect the silence, to read the signs of other people, to understand that not all danger comes from the forest itself. Sometimes the scariest thing is knowing that someone else could be out there, hiding, watching, and that you are completely alone, with only your instincts and your wits to protect you. And that knowledge, that sharp, piercing awareness of your own vulnerability, stayed with me long after I left the mountains. It stayed with me every time I stepped into the woods, a constant reminder that preparation, caution, and awareness are not just practical. They are what keep you alive.